She looked at me with a quiet warning in her eyes. If you leave now, you'll always wonder what could have been. And just like that, everything changed. The day had a soft light, the kind that seems to slow time just enough for small moments to imprint themselves on your memory. I was wandering through the quiet aisles of a local bookstore, the scent of aged paper and fresh ink wrapping around me like an old friend. It was a lazy afternoon, the kind when the world feels a little gentler, and I was alone, or so I thought. Then, she appeared. She wasn't someone you'd notice right away. Not like the loud, the flashy, or the overtly charming. Instead, she moved with a quiet grace that made her presence linger like a whispered secret. Her hair caught the light in soft waves, just the right hint of silver threading through, marking a life lived with both trials and triumphs. She was the kind of woman who didn't need to fill a room with noise to be felt, she simply was. Our eyes met across a shelf stacked with poetry collections. It wasn't a glance, not really. It was a silent exchange, like two ships passing in a calm night, both aware but cautious. I could tell there was something deeper behind those eyes, a quiet strength, but also a vulnerability barely held in check. She smiled then, a small, almost apologetic curve of her lips, as if she knew something I didn't yet. I felt the pulse in my chest quicken, not with embarrassment, but with a curious warmth that settled low and steady. It was strange, this feeling, but not unwelcome. We drifted closer, almost by accident. I reached for a book she had just put back, a collection of old love letters, and our hands brushed. Her skin was soft, warm against mine, and for a moment, I was aware of the faint tremor that passed between us. It was a touch full of unspoken questions and cautious possibility. She spoke then, her voice low and smooth like velvet, asking if I'd read the book before. I shook my head, and she nodded thoughtfully, as though choosing her words carefully. Our conversation was brief, but it felt like the beginning of something. The kind of conversation that lingers long after the last word is spoken. I noticed the way her eyes crinkled slightly when she laughed softly, a sound that seemed to echo in the quiet corners of the shop. There was an ease about her, but also a carefulness, a guarding of her heart, maybe. I felt drawn to that, as if beneath her poised exterior was a story waiting to be told. As she walked away, the scent of her perfume, something floral but with a hint of earthiness, floated behind her, wrapping around me in a memory I wasn't ready to forget. The moment was fleeting, but it left a quiet imprint, a question hanging in the air. What if this was more than just a chance meeting? Walking out into the soft glow of the afternoon, I realized that sometimes, the most unexpected encounters leave the deepest marks, especially when they come with a silent invitation to wonder, to hope, and maybe, to take a chance. The days following our first meeting were filled with an unusual restlessness. I found myself returning to the little bookstore more often than I intended, drawn not just by the books but by the hope I might see her again. It was strange, a quiet anticipation that settled deep in my chest, warming me like a secret flame I hadn't expected to carry. Then, by what felt like fate, our paths crossed again. This time, it was in a small cafe not far from the bookstore, the kind of place where the sunlight filters through tall windows, casting soft patterns on the worn wooden tables. She was there already, seated alone, her posture graceful and composed, but with a faint shadow of something I couldn't quite place lingering in her eyes. When our eyes met, the air between us shifted, charged with an unspoken recognition, as if the moment held a weight neither of us was ready to name aloud. Her smile came slowly this time, more deliberate, and it tugged at something inside me, something fragile and new. We spoke briefly, our conversation measured and polite. I noticed how she chose her words carefully, as if guarding a part of herself just beneath the surface. There was a hesitancy in her voice, a softness that softened her confident exterior. She shared little about herself, enough to hint at layers I wanted to uncover, but not enough to ease the pull of mystery that surrounded her. I found myself watching the subtle ways she moved, the way her fingers lightly touched the rim of her cup, the delicate arch of her eyebrows when she smiled. When our hands brushed accidentally over a shared newspaper, a jolt of warmth traveled from my fingertips up my arm, and my breath caught for a moment. It was in those small touches, the fleeting closeness, that the slow burn of attraction kindled between us. There was no rush, no clumsy fumbling or forced declarations, only a gentle tension that grew with every lingering glance, every pause between words. Beneath her poised and self-assured demeanor, I sensed a quiet vulnerability, like a fragile bloom hiding behind a wall of thorns. Something told me she had known loss, perhaps disappointment, and that opening herself to someone younger, someone like me, was a step both daring and terrifying. At one point, as she tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, I caught the faintest tremor in her fingers, a silent confession of nerves that made her suddenly more real, more human. I wanted to reach out, to offer reassurance, but the space between us felt sacred, a delicate balance neither of us wanted to upset too soon. As our time together ended, I noticed how her gaze lingered on mine a moment longer than before, a silent invitation or perhaps a challenge. Outside, the city hummed with its usual rush, but inside that cafe, time seemed to pause, holding its breath with us. Walking away, the scent of her perfume, subtle, with notes of jasmine and something warm, clung to the air, wrapping around me like a whisper I couldn't shake. The memory of her smile, soft yet charged with emotion, stayed with me, a gentle ache that whispered of something just beginning to bloom. In that moment, I understood that this was no ordinary connection. There was an unspoken promise in the way our worlds brushed together, tentative, fragile, but undeniable. And with every lingering glance, every small touch, the distance between us seemed to shrink, pulling us slowly into something neither of us dared to name aloud yet. There was an unspoken understanding between us now, a delicate thread weaving through our encounters, drawing us closer yet still holding us at a cautious distance. It was as if we both knew that something significant was budding, but neither was quite ready to give it a name. One quiet afternoon, she invited me for a walk in a nearby park, a place where autumn leaves drifted lazily to the ground, crunching softly beneath our footsteps. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of earth and wood smoke, grounding us in a moment that felt both fragile and real. We walked side by side, the space between us shrinking with every step. Our conversation was slower this time, more tentative. She began to share pieces of her past, not the polished stories told to acquaintances, but quiet reflections spoken in a voice that trembled slightly with the weight of memory. She told me about a love that once was, a partnership that had filled her with both joy and pain, the kind of deep connection that leaves echoes long after it fades. I listened closely, sensing the tenderness and the scars beneath her words. Her eyes held a distant sadness, but there was also strength, a fierce resilience that made her all the more captivating. As she spoke, I noticed how her hand brushed against mine, a fleeting touch that spoke louder than any words. The warmth of her skin seeped through the thin fabric of my jacket, and for a moment, I felt time slow again, the world narrowing to just the two of us and the quiet rustling of leaves around us. There was a pause, a silence pregnant with meaning, before she looked up at me, her eyes searching. It was a vulnerable gaze, an unspoken question hanging in the space between us. Could I hold this, the depth, the history, the complexities, without turning away. I reached out then, my fingers tracing the back of her hand gently, deliberately. The touch was soft but sure, an affirmation of presence and care. I wanted her to know she wasn't alone, that I was here to listen, to understand, to be patient. Her breath caught slightly as she leaned closer, resting her head briefly against my shoulder. I felt the steady rhythm of her heartbeat beneath the thin fabric of her coat, steady but quiet, a heartbeat that had weathered storms and still held hope. The world around us blurred, the distant laughter of children, the crunch of fallen leaves, the occasional bird call, all fading into a gentle backdrop for this fragile, intimate moment. We spoke less after that, words no longer necessary. The silence between us was filled with unspoken promises, with the slow building of trust and the delicate dance of two souls tentatively opening to one another. Walking back toward the city, her hand remained lightly clasped in mine, a quiet testament to a bond beginning to form. I knew this was only the beginning, that there were many layers still to uncover, many fears to face, and many moments of tenderness yet to come. But in that afternoon light, with the crisp air wrapping around us like a shared secret, I felt the unmistakable stirrings of something rare and profound. Something worth the patience, the hesitation, and the risk. The evening was quiet, the soft hum of the city fading into a distant murmur outside the window. We sat together in her living room, a space filled with the comforting scent of worn books and faint traces of lavender. The light was dim, warm and golden, casting gentle shadows that seemed to cradle us in a world apart from everything else. There was a heaviness in the air, a tension that had been quietly building, waiting for a moment to surface. She looked at me then, eyes steady but vulnerable, a complexity in her gaze that held both courage and fear. Her voice was low, almost a whisper, as she spoke words I wasn't sure I was ready to hear. "If you leave now," she said, "you'll always wonder what might have been." The sentence hung between us like a delicate glass ornament, beautiful but fragile. It wasn't a plea or a demand, but a caution born from experience, a warning against walking away before fully understanding the depth of what could grow here. She went on to explain, carefully peeling back the layers of her heart. She told me about the wounds she carried, old disappointments, moments when hope had slipped through her fingers like sand. Her past was a mosaic of joy and sorrow, of love given and lost, of risks taken and regrets held close. I could see how much it cost her to say these things, how the act of sharing was itself an act of bravery. Her hand trembled slightly as it found mine, the warmth of her skin grounding both of us in that fragile moment. There was a pause, heavy and full, before she continued. "Sometimes," she said softly, "it's easier to turn away than to face the possibility of pain again. But the pain of never knowing, that can be even harder to bear." Her words echoed in my mind, stirring a deep ache. I understood then that this wasn't just about fear, it was about the courage it takes to be vulnerable, to risk opening your heart after years of protecting it. The room felt smaller, the distance between us shrinking until it disappeared altogether. I reached up slowly, brushing a stray lock of hair behind her ear, feeling the softness of her skin against my fingertips. Her eyes fluttered closed for a moment, and I sensed the silent strength beneath her fragile exterior. For the first time, the age gap between us seemed to dissolve. What mattered wasn't years, but the shared courage to step into the unknown together. The tension that had hovered so quietly now crackled like electricity, charged with everything unsaid, the desire, the fear, the hope. I wanted to tell her that I wasn't going anywhere, that I was willing to stay and see where this could lead. But the words caught in my throat, tangled in my own hesitations and doubts. Instead, I simply held her hand a little tighter, offering what comfort I could. In that silence, we both acknowledged the fragile beginning of something that demanded patience, understanding, and above all, trust. That night, I lay awake with her warning ringing in my mind. The idea of walking away felt heavier than ever, weighed down by the quiet promise of what might be lost, and the haunting question of what I would forever wonder if I left. After that evening, a silence began to grow between us, not the easy kind that speaks of comfort, but one thick with hesitation and unspoken doubts. It was as if the fragile thread we had woven was suddenly fraying, pulled taut by fears neither of us wanted to confront openly. I found myself retreating, caught between the pull of desire and the weight of uncertainty. My mind was a storm of conflicting emotions, the warmth of her touch still vivid in my memory, yet shadowed by the apprehension of what such a connection might mean. Could I really step into a world so different from my own? Could I be the person she needed, without losing myself? Days stretched into a quiet void. Our messages, once frequent and filled with tentative hope, slowed to sporadic notes, short greetings that felt like echoes in an empty room. I imagined her reading my silence as a rejection, and the thought gnawed at me, tightening the ache in my chest. In the stillness of my apartment, I replayed our moments together, the softness of her smile, the subtle tremor in her fingers when she confided her fears, the way her eyes held stories no one else knew. Each memory was a bittersweet reminder of what I stood to lose, or perhaps, what I dared to hope for. The world outside moved on as usual, indifferent to the quiet battles waging inside me. Crowded streets felt lonelier without her presence, the hum of conversations and laughter around me a stark contrast to the silence between us. I tried to focus on my work, on distractions that could fill the growing void. But every small sound, the ping of a message, the rustle of paper, the creak of a door, seemed to carry the weight of what was missing. I longed to hear her voice again, to feel the steady warmth of her hand in mine, but pride and fear kept me from reaching out. Late at night, I would stare at my phone, fingers hovering over the screen, wrestling with the decision to break the silence. The image of her, confident yet quietly vulnerable, graceful despite the scars she bore, was never far from my thoughts. I wondered if she felt the same ache, the same restless longing. What if by pulling away, I was closing the door on something precious? What if the fear of the unknown was the only thing standing between us? Yet, the weight of expectations, mine and hers, pressed down, making the simplest step forward feel like a leap off a cliff. I wasn't sure if I was ready to fall. One afternoon, as I walked past the little cafe where we had met, a wave of nostalgia washed over me. I paused, inhaling the faint scent of jasmine and rain that seemed to hang in the air, a scent that had become hers in my mind. For a moment, I let myself imagine her sitting there, smiling gently, waiting for me. But the moment passed, and I kept walking, the distance between us growing again with every hesitant step. Inside me, a quiet battle raged, between hope and fear, desire and restraint. And somewhere deep down, I knew that if I didn't choose soon, the chance to find out what might have been could slip through my fingers forever. After days of restless nights and wandering thoughts, I found myself unable to ignore the quiet ache any longer. The silence between us had grown heavy, thick with everything left unsaid, and the more I tried to push it away, the more it pulled me back. The truth was simple but terrifying. I missed her, her presence, her voice, the way she made the world feel both gentler and more vivid. One evening, I sat alone with the weight of my doubts pressing down, the phrase she had said swirling in my mind, "If you leave now, you'll always wonder." Those words were a gentle challenge, a quiet invitation to be brave. To risk the unknown. To embrace the vulnerability I had been avoiding. I typed a message, hesitated, then sent it, a simple, "Can we meet?" It wasn't grand or poetic, but it was honest. And to my relief, she replied almost immediately with a yes. We chose a small, quiet garden tucked away from the city's noise, a place she loved, she told me, for its calm and the way the light played through the leaves in the late afternoon. When I arrived, she was already there, sitting on a bench surrounded by blooming flowers, their delicate scent weaving through the air. Her smile when she saw me was soft, tentative, like a door slowly opening. The years between us felt less important in that moment. What mattered was the connection rekindling, fragile but real. We sat close, but not too close, just enough to feel the warmth between us, the gentle rise and fall of her breath mingling with mine. Our conversation was slow and unhurried, filled with pauses that spoke louder than words. She shared more of her hopes and fears, her voice steady but tinged with relief that I had returned. When our hands met, it was deliberate this time, fingers intertwining softly, the warmth spreading through me like sunlight breaking through clouds. The touch was a promise, a reassurance that neither of us had to face our doubts alone. At one point, she leaned her head gently against my shoulder, and I felt the steady rhythm of her heartbeat beneath the thin fabric of her sweater. It was a quiet, grounding presence, a reminder that this fragile new beginning was real. Around us, the garden seemed to hold its breath, the gentle rustling of leaves, the soft chirping of distant birds, and the fading light casting a golden glow that wrapped us in a cocoon of calm. There was no rush, no need to define or label what was happening. Instead, we simply existed in the moment, two souls carefully reaching out, embracing the vulnerability that comes with hope and trust. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the garden path, I realized that this was the true risk, to open your heart again, despite the fear, despite the unknown. But it was also the greatest reward. In her presence, I felt a quiet courage growing inside me, a willingness to face whatever came next, together. That evening marked a turning point, a gentle step forward on a path neither of us could predict, but both were eager to explore. And in that fragile, tender space, the possibility of something beautiful began to take root. The days that followed our meeting in the garden felt like the beginning of a new chapter, not because everything had changed overnight, but because a gentle understanding had settled between us, an unspoken promise that whatever the future held, we would face it together. We found comfort in small moments, sitting side by side on her worn, but cozy sofa, sharing quiet cups of tea in the soft morning light, lingering over books and music, the world outside slipping away as we simply existed in each other's presence. It wasn't about grand gestures or sweeping declarations. Instead, it was in the subtle touches, the way her hand would rest lightly on my knee, or how I'd brush a stray lock of hair behind her ear with a tenderness that felt like a silent, "I'm here." Each movement carried a weight of care and intention, weaving a fabric of closeness that felt both new and deeply familiar. One afternoon, as the sun filtered through the curtains, casting a golden glow around us, she leaned in just enough for her cheek to rest softly against my shoulder. I felt the warmth of her breath, the gentle rise and fall of her chest, and the steady beat of her heart in a rhythm that somehow matched my own. There was a stillness in that moment, a quiet intimacy that needed no words. It was an acknowledgement of the journey we had traveled, the fears we had faced, and the hope we now held. Our eyes met, and in that gaze was a depth of feeling that neither of us had dared to speak aloud but both deeply understood. If there had been hesitation before, it melted away into a sense of belonging. experience, and past scars mattered less than the connection we had nurtured with patience and honesty. It was a connection rooted not in fleeting passion, but in respect, tenderness, and a shared willingness to be vulnerable. We talked about life, about dreams, about the quiet fears that still lingered. Our conversations were honest and open, woven with laughter and occasional silence, each moment drawing us closer without rushing toward a destination. In those days, I realized that love, the kind that lasts, isn't always about fireworks or grand adventures. Sometimes, it's the gentle unfolding of trust, the quiet understanding that two people can choose each other, again and again, in the small everyday acts of kindness and presence. We didn't need to define what we were, not yet, anyway. What mattered was that we were here, together, building something real and tender in the space between us. The story that had begun with a chance encounter, with lingering glances and cautious steps, was now a living, breathing connection. One that promised patience, respect, and the quiet joy of companionship. And as the days slipped softly into evenings, I knew this was no longer a question of wondering or hesitation. It was a warm certainty, a gentle promise, the kind that doesn't always need words, but can be felt in the touch of a hand, the meeting of eyes, and the steady beat of two hearts learning to beat in time.